on the end, you can kind of see that plastic piece is about flush with the end of the cap there. So, and then inside there you can kind of see the O-rings and the spacers, and you want those to be all lined up in there. So once we get that all done, what I like to do is just put just a dab of oil inside there, just to kind of make sure that that's all lubricated. So when you put this shock shaft in there, sometimes these threads can be a little sharp, and you want to make sure that even if you have to put just some 1000 grit sandpaper on that, to make sure those threads are not sharp, because if you push that through those O-rings and it tears that O-ring, you might as well expect it to leak. So this is one of the real important steps. So once you get that shock shaft in there, you want to be real careful pushing it through your O-rings, and if it feels like it's going to catch, you want to stop what you're doing, because if those O-rings tear, your shocks will leak, and generally if you have a leaky shock, it's coming from those O-rings. So that's a real important step right there. So once we get that in there, we'll move on to filling the shock body. Now they come with this bladder, and basically what this bladder does, if you want to zoom out a little bit, this bladder kind of compresses a little bit when this shock shaft goes into your body of the shock, and it takes up the volume that this shaft takes up, and then this bladder will kind of absorb some of that excess volume. So it's kind of neat. However, in function, this bladder is not quite big enough, or doesn't have quite the capacity to accept the full length of the shaft. So if you were to fill this with oil, put your bladder on there, and then shove this shaft in, it goes in about halfway. Now, without getting into great detail of what's happening in there, you're getting a hydraulic lock, and we're going to do that. It kind of makes a mess, but we're going to put it together as maybe most of you will, and we're going to show you what happens. So generally, a high dollar shock that you have a bladder, you're going to extend your shaft, you're going to fill that with oil, and you're going to fill it almost to the top, not quite. So we're about 3/4 full, maybe a little more. And then once you get the oil in there, you're going to cycle this piston 1 or 2 times. And what's happening is we want to get the air that's down here up here. So we'll pull this back down, and then if you look closely in there, you might see air bubbles inside that oil. And what we're going to try and do is get all that air out of there, so that you don't have this squishy sounding shock. So anyway, without going into great detail of all the air bubbles, we're going to put our bladder on there, and you can see the oil coming out. So what we have here is a condition where the air is completely taken out of this shock, and then we've got our bladder on there, and generally that's how you would put together a high dollar shock, like in a low C or an associated track car or any of the others. That's how you would build that. Now let's watch what happens. Now when this comes in, as this piston goes in, the volume of this shaft enters in here. Well, the bladder is supposed to pick up that volume or excess volume from this shaft and squish that bladder, and it kind of makes a spring inside here. Well, as we push the shaft in, it locks. and you can, we can see that what's happening in there is that piston, or I'm sorry, that bladder in there is squishing, and I can feel it kind of compress. And when you push it out, the bladder expands and pushes the piston back out because we're under a little bit of pressure. Now, here's the problem that I have with this shock. Okay, it's got the bladder and everything's great and it's all perfect. The design is super neat. However, the bladder is not big enough to absorb the full length of the shaft. So what's that mean? Well, you're not going to get the whole stroke of your shock if you build it the way I just built it, which is generally how you would build a shock with a bladder in it. So if you do this, and maybe on the back shocks you want it a little stiffer, I guess you could. The problem I have with this is if you build it like this and you're going down the trail and you're banging those rocks and pounding this thing, there's a lot of pressure that builds up in here and this will leak. It's almost a guarantee that you're going to leak down here, up here, or through those O-rings. So is this going to be a failure? Yes, this will definitely be a failure if you build it like this. Eventually, banging on that thing all day long, something's going to give and that oil's going to get pushed out of there somewhere. So that's kind of a con as far as I'm concerned with this, design, or shall we say level of shock, or price of shock maybe is the right term. But anyway, we're going to show you how to fix that and build this correctly. And it's not that hard. It just the sequence of oil and the position of this shaft just has to be changed. So it's not that hard. So we're going to take it apart real time and fix it. And it's pretty simple to fix.